Is that the control for this?
No,
Oh, okay.
this is a camera.
Oh, gotcha. Good evening, everyone. My name is Linda McKinney Herbert, Waitsburg High School, class of 72. So when I was a kid growing up, the Weller Library was simply that narrow back room in the back of the building. It was floor-to-ceiling books. It had every Nancy Drew mystery and the entire Hardy Boy series. I devoured them. I'm happy to say that my taste in literature improved quickly after that. But I am just really tickled to be even a small part of this fundraiser tonight for this really great cause. And I was so delighted when Charles asked me to introduce him because I have such respect and admiration for him and for his work. So I'm not going to repeat all of the awards and accolades that you read about in the Waitsburg Times, but I don't think it will surprise any of you to know that everywhere Charles has lived, he has been a huge part of the poetry scene. Walla Walla has been no exception. In the 80s, he bought the Masonic Temple building in Walla Walla, which is located at the intersection of Alder and Colville, where the patisserie is. Everybody knows where the patisserie is, right? And in the upstairs, he ran the Temple bookstore for a number of years. He orchestrated 7 Walla Walla poetry parties, bringing in poets from 24 states and a half a dozen foreign countries to read. He was the editor and the publisher of the Temple magazine, the only magazine on this planet that printed original contemporary poetry in both Spanish and Chinese with English translations. Charles has always been a friend and a mentor of young people, including a carload of Texans who traveled up here to acquaint themselves with this Walla Walla poet whose work they were so drawn to. They ended up staying for a while. They lived in the Temple building, they immersed themselves in the poetry scene, and they played music. Which is how it came to be that Charles is the only poet that I know of that has had a band named after him. The Charles Potts Magic Windmill Band. They played New York City style experimental country. Yeah, right? The thing is, they were really good. They had catchy tunes, they had very clever lyrics, and they had tremendous harmony. So check them out online, okay? Charles grew up with horses in south central Idaho. And for 48 years of his life without horses, he's now making up for lost time raising Appaloosas. Now, he probably hasn't bred every single possible combination of spots and solids, but it's probably pretty close. A friend once asked Charles, "So Charles, how many horses do you have?" And he replied, "One cannot have too many horses." Some of you may have been taken aback a little bit by reading in the Waitsburg Times that he spent a summer in his aunt's coal bin reading 2 or 3 books a day. Really? A coal bin? Well, along that vein, I would like to make a pitch for Charles's autobiography, Valga Cruza. It's a fascinating read about a fascinating life. Personally, I found I could hardly put it down. And let's just say that to know Charles today is to not really know Charles. So I highly recommend you get your hands on Valga Cruza. Besides being passionate about politics, his family, his raspberry patch, and his yoga, Charles has had a continuing and very keen interest, not only in history, but the analysis of history. His first book on the subject, How the West finally won the Civil War, was published in 1995. Now, very interestingly, 25 years later, Oxford Press releases the book by Heather Cox Richardson, How the South Won the Civil War. Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continued Fight for the Soul of America. So think about that, 25 years before his time here. Tonight, he is here to share readings from his second book, The Fifth Convulsion. I personally believe that both of his books deserve a place on the shelf in the Weller Library. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Mr. Charles Potts.
Thank you, Linda. I hope there's room for more chairs or stools to come over and sit down and be somewhat comfortable, because actually we're going to do about 400 years in slightly under an hour, so we're going to be at high speed. I would like you to think about the 400 years of American history since the European incursion. Actually, everything that's happened in the last 400 years is recent. This is considered to be the long view of history. I learned about the long view. I had a Chinese college student living in my house once, and she was studying history, American history, with Dr. Deal at Whitman. And she couldn't understand why it was so short, because Chinese history, of course, is 6 or 8 times that long. But what I plan to do for you tonight, my intention is to give you some handles on 400 years of American history, connect what's going on now with what has taken place in the first or what took place during the first 4 convulsions, and make some suggestions about how we can cope with, there's an old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. And if these aren't interesting times, I don't know what it would take to get your attention, because something is going wrong around the clock somewhere. And we need to understand how that happened. The first 4 convulsions, the first one was the King Phillips War. The second one was the Revolutionary War. The third one was the Civil War. And the most recent one was the World War II, which not only was an American convulsion, but it involved, to a much greater extent than the people in the United States, most of the rest of the world. A great deal of China, all of Japan, half of Russia, all of Germany and France. It was a first-class disaster. You'll notice that in the first 4 convulsions, all of them had to do with a war. We will be exceptionally lucky if the convulsion we're wandering our way around in now does not involve a major war. It would be a good idea not to. There's been a war going on, a trade war between China and the United States, and perhaps they can confine it to that. I don't know. We will have to see. But one of the identifying features of a convulsion is that things are really different on the near side of a convulsion than they were on the far side of a convulsion. With the King Phillips War, Massachusetts had been really pretty decent to the colonists for many, many years. And this detente, I would call it maybe, between the Native Americans and the colonists came to an end with King Phillips. His Indian name was Metacom, but in order to put it in the history books, he's known as King Philip. The colonists named him after the son of Philip of Macedonia. It was a really tough war for everybody concerned. 12, 15 cities in New England were destroyed, burned to the ground. At least that many were damaged. There were more people killed per capita in that American war than any other one. And after the King Phillips War, the news that it was going to be a struggle for the rest of the continent was written pretty large for everybody. The Indians to the west had trouble organizing. You know, there was a whole bunch of them: Pontiac, Tecumseh, Black Hawk. The Indian War system is still going on. It more or less came to a halt maybe in 1890 with the massacre at Wounded Knee. The Revolutionary period technically started at approximately 1763 with the end of what's called the War of the Wilderness, or the French and Indian War. The proclamation that ended that war said the Americans are not supposed to go over the Appalachian Divide. You're confined to the Atlantic seaboard. Well, Daniel Boone didn't get the message, and the next year he was in Kentucky. And then the war, you know, one of the consequences of the King Phillips War is that the British finally noticed that there were colonies over here. They weren't paying much attention to them up to that point, but they thought, hey, if these guys can win a war on their own, they're probably generating enough commerce to tax. And so they came over and they opened a church in Boston, you know, put the Pilgrims out of the business of monopolizing religion, and so forth, started taxing them and so on. And the history of the Revolution is probably better known than any of the other convulsions. And it effectively ended in 1815 when Napoleon lost to Wellington at Waterloo. And Andrew Jackson beat the British at the Battle of New Orleans 2 weeks after the war was over. But it was kind of hard to get the news in those days. I want to have you remember 1815 as a really important date in American history and in world history. One of the books, this is about raising money for the library. Anything I allude to or say is contained in the books in spades, in detail. One of the books that has been powerful influence on me was David Hackett Fisher's The Great Wave, Price Revolutions and the Rhythm of History. Because prices have collapsed 3 times in Western civilization. They collapsed in 1348 with the Black Death at the end of the Middle Ages. Prices are trying to collapse now. I will get into that a little bit later. Prices collapsed again at the Renaissance at precisely the same time that Columbus, quote, discovered America, unquote. And they collapsed again in 1815. And the other important news from 1815, there's a famous German author whose book has never been out of print since it was printed. It's called The Decline of the West in English, although in German it's called Der Untergang des Abendlandes, meaning the going under of the evening lands. 1815, according to Oswald Spengler, is the date that Western civilization started going sideways and turned from culture into civilization, became a holding action, in other words. There was the prices were stable all during the night. It's called the Victorian equilibrium. I refer to the period between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War as the First Republic. We were taught as children to admire Daniel Webster and Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun for their capacity to compromise and keep the American Republic headed in the right direction. Well, of course, it didn't work very well. And it didn't work because the Civil War was primarily about slavery. And half of the people fighting in the Civil War were considering African Americans to be human beings. And the other half, the losing half initially at least, considered slaves to be property. They were in fact capital. When the Civil War broke out in Texas in 1861, the slaves in Texas had a higher assessed valuation than all the real estate in Texas. That'll give you an idea of how important they were as economic ciphers. The Civil War basically ended in 1876 with the fraudulent installation of Rutherford B. Hayes into the White House, but it had gone on from 1850 until 1876. I refer to the second period of between the Civil War and World War II as the forced republic, when they dragged the South back into the Union, tried to make them shape up, passed a few more amendments to the Constitution and so on. And then the Depression and the Civil War. There's a chapter in here on the Constitution of the United States. I don't intend to talk at great length about the Constitution, except I do want to mention its 4 major deficiencies. To begin with, in Article 1, Section 1, they create 2 houses of the legislature, a House of Representatives and a Senate. They also give these houses the right to set their own rules. They don't have to play fair, in other words. They can change the rules as they want to. The most egregious part of that is that the House of Representatives, that is the Senate, or the Senate is as a legislative body, the seats are apportioned by states. It was a form of political bribe that Virginia, New York, Massachusetts made to Delaware and Rhode Island to get them to ratify the Constitution in the first place. We'll give you 2 senators. You know, it works out now like this. You know, there are 2 senators in Wyoming, each representing about 400,000 people. There are 2 senators from California, each representing almost 20 million people. And you expect the legislation to make sense in this country? It does not, and that's the reason. The other tough part of the Constitution is the Electoral College, and the real stranglehold on the Constitution and on our civilization is the fact that it's virtually impossible to change it. The conservatives who put the Constitution together, all 39 of them, were relatively well off. And the conservative position, as I understand it from having studied it, I wrote a facetious poem many years ago, said, I've been in Walla Walla for 15 years doing field study of white Republicans. And now I've been here for 40 years, and the field study goes on. But the basic conservative position is everything is fine. Why would we want to change anything? And the basic conservative position as we sit here this afternoon or this evening is that we have 3 planks in our platform. We want lower taxes for the rich. We want to spend more money on the military than even the military can figure out how to spend. And we want to pack the courts with conservatives. We have no other agenda. We don't really want to pass any legislation, and so we can stop it. So that's the Constitution. It is.
So, excuse me, Charles. Would you reiterate again? You said there were 3 deficiencies in the Constitution. What were they?
I'm sorry. What the question again?
You mentioned 3 deficiencies in the Constitution.
Yes.
What are they again?
The bicameral legislation with the Senate apportioned on geography instead of population, the Electoral College, and the really complicated and supermajority efforts to amend the Constitution. The last serious attempt to amend the Constitution in a fundamental manner was undertaken by Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana in the late 1960s, early 70s. He had Richard Nixon's support for this, and it was talked to death by Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina employing the rules of the filibuster. So we did not get rid of the Electoral College. What happens in our society now, why we're in this convulsion, is directly attributable to these deficiencies in the Constitution. 2 Republican presidents in the last 20 years were elected without a majority popular vote. They were elected, in other words, by the Electoral College. If the votes had been counted appropriately, Al Gore and Hillary Clinton would have been president. These 2 Republican presidents had nominated 6 of the 9 members of the Supreme Court. When cases get to the Supreme Court, they say, well, this Voting Rights Act, what's that's all about? Who cares if these people vote anyway? Let's give this power back to the states and take it away from them. Or the Republicans get a case about, well, hey, money is speech. I'm talking money here, real money. The United States is run, in case you want to look into it, by the military-industrial complex and the energy business. They have a lockhold on the American government. And I don't know how you're going to get rid of them. Well, anyway. So here we are in this convulsion. One of the, during my extended youth, that is to say, I was born in World War II, almost 80 years ago in 1943. And so when I look back, if you look back 80 years from 1943, you wind up in the middle of the Civil War. Our history is really short. It's only 2 lifetimes end to end. And you're right back at Appomattox and Antietam. Wow. I'm thinking, this is nuts. But during my youth, as I was saying, I got used to digesting problems one at a time. There was the Korean War, then there was Eisenhower and his mischievous with the CIA, and then there was the Kennedy assassination, and then there was Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, and then the war in Vietnam, and then there was Nixon, and then Watergate. But it was one thing after another. It wasn't 6 things all at once, which is where we are now. One of the things that's most persistent in this culture is how does the majority treat African Americans primarily and other people of color? And this has been a problem since 1619, 400 years. It's a very reliable problem. It was a big problem in my youth in the 60s. The African Americans got sick of the way they were treated and set fire to Newark and Watts and several other cities in this country. They got some legislation passed then. One of the test cases for how do you get good legislation in this country with conservatives holding most of the cards, there was a period in like 1862, for instance, when the South left the Union because they lost control of the country. The Congress passed the Homestead Act, the Railroad Act, and the Morrill Act. The Morrill Act created the state university systems. The first state university was Michigan State, Washington State. All of these state universities owe their origination to the Morrill Act, which was passed by so-called liberals in the North after the South bailed into the Confederacy. The other time intelligent legislation was passed in this country was when Franklin Roosevelt, during the Depression, had big majorities and got a lot of things passed. He didn't get the Depression ended, but he was certainly trying hard enough. The last time serious legislation was passed in this country was probably 1964. Lyndon Johnson had 67 senators in the Democratic Party at that time, and even then he could barely get stuff passed because most of those senators were in fact Southerners. This race problem is with us every day. And we see it in the newspapers. Young African Americans are killed. Some black coach pipes up and says, 90% of the athletes in the NFL are black, but only one coach. How does that work? It's all around us. And one of the things about this convulsion that I think is like, let's look on the happy side. Things will be different on the other side of the convulsion. Let's hope that something is different about the race problem on the other side of the convulsion, but it might take 2 convulsions to get to it, because it will become manageable when more than half of the people in this country are of mixed race. We're on their way there now. There are a lot of children, you know, suppose your mother is a Korean and your father is white, and you get the census papers. What do you check? You check Korean, you check white, you check other. But that could happen, but it's one of the most persistent things. One of the other most persistent things that's going on in this convulsion is this financial problem. Many of you in this room can undoubtedly remember back in the late 90s, President Bill Clinton and Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich managed to balance the budget. The expenses were equal to the income, and everybody thought, wow, that's going to be terrific. Well, it's only a little more than 20 years later, and the federal deficit is now $30 trillion. You can't go too far separating value added from compensation before you run into problems. We've all experienced the 7% inflation that's been going on, which is probably going to get worse. One of the consequences, I referred earlier to a book called The Great Wave, Price Revolutions and the Rhythm of History. One of the things that David Hackett Fisher says about price revolutions is as you move up to a deflationary period, there's a bifurcation of populations between the really rich, who are very few, and the really poor, who are many. And that has happened with our, as we move into our convulsion. You know, it is, our financial system basically started with at Bretton Woods before the end of World War II, which made the dollar the exchange currency for world trade. As we move along through the financial episode of going through this empire, in the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson took the silver coins out of circulation, and in 1967, he took the silver certificates out of circulation, indicating that all of a sudden, these are Federal Reserve notes. They're not dollar bills anymore. The money when I was a kid, when it wasn't real silver dollars, it used to say, payable to the bearer on demand, $1 in silver from the United States Treasury. Well, Lyndon Johnson couldn't keep up. They didn't want to make any bigger mess in Kellogg, Idaho than they already had with mining more silver. So he took the silver certificates off. A little later, Nixon let gold float, you know. I mean, silver and gold are actual money. These silver notes, these Federal Reserve notes that we have in our pockets are only as good as the belief that other people have in them. Because economics is a faith-based activity. It's not about numbers. It's about whether you believe the person making the promise and whether the money is really any good. We're going to find out whether it's any good as we go along, because in 1985, during the Reagan administration, there was a Plaza Accord, because the Japanese seemed to be taking away all the fun. So they made the dollar weak and made the yen strong, and the Japanese opportunists. I lived in Japan for a year and studied. I learned how to read Japanese by reading an encyclopedia of economics written in Japanese. And the Japanese economic system makes the one that we have look like the mess that it is. In Japan, the Monbusho, the bureaucracy that handles the money, collects the taxes, sets the rates. It has all the functions of the Federal Reserve Board, the Office of Management and Budget, for both the House and the President. All of it's in one little place. They took this Plaza Accord stuff back to Japan and said, hey, you know, we will take our money, the yen, we'll move it to the United States and Europe. We're borrowing it from Nichigen, the Japanese bank. at 1%, we're taking it to Europe and lending it for 8 and bringing the spread back as if it was earned income. You know, we're so cool. We can shave gold flakes into our tea. You know, we're just. And then Nichigen got wise to them and cut them off. 4 years later, New Year's Day or the end of the year in 1989, they cut them off, and Japan has been in what they call a fukyo ever since. I'm looking at this word. I'm talking to my language partner. I said, "What is a fukyo?" I said, "I look it up in the dictionary. It says depression. This isn't the depression, you know." One thing I can say about the Japanese, the economy over there is pretty well distributed. Lots of people participate in it. They work hard, but they're actually rewarded for it. What makes this a fukyo? I found the answer in a book called The Bubble Economy, The Collapse of the Japanese Economic Miracle. There was a gentleman named Christopher Wood who used to manage the Financial Times, some big outfit. He was in Tokyo anyway. He was The Economist. He was the desk person, the desk chair for The Economist magazine in Tokyo, and he published this book. And he said this, and this is something a handle that I would like to have you leave with. A recession is a superabundance of inventory. If there's too much inventory and people get some money, they can buy the stuff, and the inventory will go down, production will go up, everything will roll along. The recessions aren't that serious, or not as serious as depressions. What makes an economy a depression is a superabundance of capacity, which Japan has. They've topped out. They can't make any more Toyotas or refrigerators or computers or any of the other stuff that they make so well because there's nobody to buy it. This fantastic world economy that we're living in only involves at most 2 billion people, maybe 2.5. The other 5 or 6 billion people don't have floors in their houses. Their children don't have shoes. They're not inoculated. You know, the abject poverty that they're living in would make all of us, you know, this room full of people could feed an entire village with the money that we waste compared to most of the rest of the world. Our economy, the world economy, is in this Great Depression and doesn't know it because all of the money is going for the wrong things. Hey, it's got to go to the people who need it the most. That's one of the reasons why this convulsion is going to take place, because as Dr. Fisher would point out, what happens during a financial collapse is that there's a reversion to the mean. This enormous mountain of money that Jeff Bezos makes by delivering stuff to me, you know, I buy stuff from Amazon too, but the streets he drives on, Jeff Bezos didn't pay for. We paid for them. The people paid for them with taxes. You know, they're public utilities. And he uses them as if they were free. And for him, they are free. But so this financial mess, since 1985, the United States has been trying to outrun this deflationary spiral. It's not a spiral, it's a loop. They don't want to go into deflation because it's bad for business, for among other things. You know, like if you go back to the Middle Ages when that economy collapsed, and reliable numbers are hard to find, but what I read is that somewhere between 40 and 60% of the people in Europe perished from the Black Death. Now there's quite a gap between 40% and 60%, but let's say half of the people died. More of them died in the warmer parts of the Mediterranean part of Europe. Fewer of them died where it was colder, in Germany, Scandinavia, England, and so forth. That'd knock a real hole in your process if you lose half your customers or half your suppliers or something like that. So the solution offered to the United States, let's go back to the year 2000 when George W. Bush was installed as president, one of the first things they did, because they had inherited a balanced budget, was, hey, we're giving too much money to the government, let's cut taxes. And so they did. They cut them really strongly. And they also blundered into a war, a couple of wars that they didn't really need to fight against Iraq and Afghanistan. So there's this financial problem, this $30 trillion overhang, and this coming reversion to the mean is going to hit people really hard. Back in the day, that is to say, when Lyndon Johnson took the silver certificates out of circulation, guess what started going up in value and price in 1967? Real estate. Before that, real estate was cheap, you know. But after 1967, I thought, well, wait, maybe I should put my money in something that means something, you know, that has a floor to it and a wall, or some tangible thing. And so the real estate started climbing. These taxes, the Republicans undid them again when Donald Trump was president, and helped. But basically what the United States is trying to do by making all this money available is they're trying to liquefy this deflation. They're going to try to drown the baby in the bathwater of liquidity to avoid deflation. I personally don't think they're going to make it, but...
No, wait a minute. Explain what you just said again.
What's that?
Explain what you just said again.
What I just said was that every time the deflation gets close, the Federal Reserve dumps more money into the system. They want to drown deflation with liquidity. I'm not at all sure they'll make it. But then I'm a skeptic about funny finance. But another thing that happened during the Trump administration was some cases got to the Supreme Court wondering about the appropriateness of the voting rights laws that the federal government had superimposed on the South with Lyndon Johnson's Voting Rights Act. They've been chipping away at this for a long time, but they really did a number on it with the Supreme Court when Trump was president. This is one of the effects of having a minority-controlled government. And one of the biggest problems that we have here is this completely constipated political system. I would refer to you the book here called How the South Finally Won the Civil War, because more than half, 5 of the 6 things that the South were fighting for are public policy right now. And the South is back in control of the United States. They were in control of the United States before the Civil War. Nobody disputes that. Albert Kazan, all kinds of people, all the presidents from Virginia. There were a couple of dudes, the Adams family from Massachusetts. When they got tired of the Virginia gentry, they rolled in Andrew Jackson and his Democrats. You know, the doctors killed Zachary Taylor, who might have single-handedly stopped the Civil War. But Zachary Taylor was a general. He had been, let's say, or not wasn't, had been Jefferson Davis's father-in-law. Jefferson Davis was a bright young Army guy, and he fell in love with Zachary Taylor's daughter, Sarah Knox Taylor. And being a good father, Zachary Taylor didn't want his daughter marrying some Army rat. And so they kind of snuck around, and even though Jefferson Davis was a graduate of West Point, the Army was the love of his life. He was more in love with Sarah Knox Taylor. He resigned from the Army. They got married, moved to his brother's plantation in Mississippi, and 90 days later, Sarah Knox Taylor died of malaria. And Jefferson Davis went into a depression that he basically never came out of. Zachary Taylor, on the other hand, helps win the Mexican War, gets elected president, and he's looking at people like his former son-in-law, Jefferson Davis, who's a senator from Mississippi, saying, if you bastards try to get out of this union, I'll have you all hanged. You're not going anywhere. President Taylor got sick, and the medical profession comes in for a few licks here. They showed up to take care of him. What did they do? They bled him. You know, President Washington was bled. You know, it was the go-to move. You know, for 19th century. You know, I mean, Walter Reed, for whom the famous hospital is named, had exactly 6 weeks of medical training before they gave him a black bag with some forceps and a scalpel and sent him out to the war. They didn't know much in those days. Well, they bled the guy, and then they gave him enough ipecac and quinine that would kill Martina Navratilova. And he went under. They just exhumed his body sometime in the last 10 years to try to see if they'd been deliberately poisoned. I mean, so.
Was he? Was he?
No. Well, no, it was just iatrogenic. It was a medical malpractice. I mean, I would call it, you know, if overdose on ipecac and quinine.
Not even any gin.
Huh?
Not even any gin.
Not even what?
Any gin.
Any
Gin
gin.
with the quinine water. Sorry.
Okay. I was going to say, Joe, if what I'm telling you brings up any questions for you, sit on them until we're done, if you can, and I will try to answer as many of them as I can, and sign books for you. And you have to remember that this is a fundraiser for the library. Any books you buy, the money goes directly to the library. I get nothing out of this except the pleasure of trying to help you. Because one of the things that I think is imperative on all of us is that we don't get hit by falling pieces of the empire. We just have to try to stay alive and alert and ahead of it, if that's possible. But as I said, the South lost the Civil War, the battles, but they started getting it back right away. You know, they discovered that the amendments were really loosely written, and that they could avoid providing voting rights for African Americans in the South, and that they could get away with murder, and they did, lots of it. And the riots down there, the Colfax riots, I mean, they burned Tulsa to the ground in 1921. No significant consequences to doing that. I mean, nobody was ever, you know, charged, or, I mean, but in the meantime, the South is working their way back into the picture. The Democrats, of which I used to be one, maybe I still am, Franklin Roosevelt owed his 4 terms in office to what used to be called the Solid South. They were Democrats, white, racist Democrats, and Roosevelt himself has been fingered as a racist. But every time someone tries to take a step to solve this racial problem, there's big backlash. Harry Truman integrated the armed forces. It so pissed off Senator Thurman that Senator Thurman ran against him in 1948 as a Dixiecrat and carried 5 states in the South, the worst part of the South. This is important because the Democratic Party let Strom Thurmond back in right away. We had a little misunderstanding, Thurm. Just come on down. You know, back in. There was another candidate for president in 1948 named Henry Agard Wallace, who was the vice president between 1941 and 1945. He ran as a progressive with a guy from Idaho named Glenn Taylor, Senator Taylor from Idaho. Those guys never got the time of day from the Democratic Party. after 1948. I saw Glenn Taylor lose to Frank Church in Idaho in 1956 when I was a kid, wondering what was going on. Kennedy, Nixon, Strom Thurmond, changeling, hypocrite. You know, he was the father of a daughter by his family's maid, and he kept that concealed his entire life. This hypocrite racist decided to become a Republican in 1948 because he still hated Hubert Humphrey, who had given the South a really bad time. Hubert Humphrey could really do a stem-winding speech. He said, "When are we going to have civil rights in this country? If not now, when are we going to do it?" And he talked like that at the Democratic Convention in 1948, among the other reasons why Strom Thurmond freaked out. Well, here's this guy, Humphrey, much changed and warped out of his mind, running for president in 1968. Thurmond goes back to South Carolina as a Republican and helps Nixon become president. And so the Republicans in the South developed this affinity for one another based on their racism and their ability to manipulate the system, because the forced republic, the one that ended with the Depression and World War II, ended basically with the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The great poet Robert Duncan said, "Man has made war too terrible to wage." We better hope that he was right. But as we move through the rest of our economic or political unraveling, we get to the South being reliably Republican. And at the present moment, for example, the 50 senators from the South and their friends, conservative senators from the West and the Midwest, and three ladies who I've never been able to figure out, Susan Collins, Joni Ernst, and Lisa Murkowski, they represent about 43% of the population. And the 50 Democrats, including 2 independents, represent 57% of the population. Minority government is a real problem. And the real problem with having the South in charge is that they superimpose the siege mentality on us. It's pretty clear that the Confederacy was under siege from 1861 to 1865 until they surrendered. But after World War II was over, Truman and the Congress passed the CIA and the NSA Acts, which basically made foreign policy a secret. We have no idea. We can read the newspapers, hey, the Russians are going to invade. No, they're not. They're backing up. We're just bluffing. You're kidding. You're making it all up. You're trying to goad us into a war. No, you're really, you haven't backed up at all. You're reinforcing the truth. We have no idea. And we have no idea where they are. Like one of the little incidents in this book, I talk about the, I don't know what to call it. Let's call it an incident at Tongo Tongo. Tongo Tongo is in Niger. It's in the middle of Africa. Niger is a country just north of Nigeria. It's separated by the Niger River from Nigeria. All of a sudden, there's an incident in the newspaper with half a dozen Americans and 10 or 12 Nigerians getting killed in a battle to try to get a hold of some terrorists in Niger. And most people in this country had never heard of Niger, let alone knew that we were fighting a war there. And that's what the siege mentality does for us, Could we possibly be under siege from Niger? Or what exactly do we have to lose in the Ukraine? Or Afghanistan has buried 2 empires before ours, the Russian Empire, the British Empire, they're good at that. Because it's too far away to matter, but these entities like the United States were under siege. The South is in control. They're in control of the legislature. That is the chief distinguishing feature of these convulsions. I have no idea how I'm doing for time, so I was sort of trying to wrap up here. The problem with not being able to legislate things. In a parliamentary democracy or something like that, you have a problem, you address it with legislation. Things change, society changes, pressure builds up. You write some legislation. In this country, you don't do that. You just kick it down the road. They manage, people talk about let's have some bipartisanship here. We have a bipartisan government, but it's the Southern bipartisan government. They decided exactly how much infrastructure we could afford, and then they joined the Democrats and passed it as a big unity program. But they don't want any of the other stuff in Build Back Better. None of it. None of it. They don't want the Voting Rights Act. They don't want anything done about the climate. They don't want to make it easier for poor people with kids to take care of them. What's all that about? Why don't these people take care of themselves? I heard some conservatives talking the other day about paying people not to work. Well, what about our military and paying people not to fight? We got 800,000 people that we pay not to fight, day in and day out. And there's a lot of them. I'm really proud of the fact that this book beat Oxford University Press and a Harvard-trained historian by 25 years. Among the people that the South won with was a guy named John Calhoun. I mentioned him before. He was vice president once with. He resigned. He was vice president with Andrew Jackson, and resigned because they disagreed about nullification. But he became a powerful senator, and he wrote something called a Disquisition on Government. It's not something that is read often, but it could be read with great benefit to all of us. John Calhoun was called by Richard Hofstadter, that probably knows more about American history or knew more about American history than anybody else I know of. He wrote the textbook that I studied history when I was in college. Hofstadter called Calhoun the Marx of the master class. Who would think the master class needed a Marx, Well, they got one. In the Disquisition on Government, what Calhoun says, and this is the basic premise that operates the Southern-controlled American government. Security always trumps liberty, always. And the capacity to tax divides people into two classes. A class that benefits and a class that suffers. That's American government. There's a few other happy people in here, Jefferson Davis, Colonel Buck Travis, I'll neither surrender nor retreat. God, they made so much fun of President Biden because he had the good sense to get out of Afghanistan. And even to say a word about the former president, he wanted to get out of Afghanistan. And the military said, we can still win this war, Or poor Barack Obama, back in 2009, spends $5 billion sending 5,000 soldiers to Afghanistan. That's $1 million a piece. What do you get for it? Nothing. You get anything for it. And the real crisis of all the ones that I mentioned that are really in front of us is the inability of the system to do anything serious about the climate crisis. I wrote a review of this book and published it in the Union Bulletin a couple of years ago. It's called The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming by David Wallace Wells. This is a compendium of all of the things that are going to happen to us. And he points out in here that the scientists are perpetually understating the problem. They just did it again. The NOAA said, well, the sea is going to go up by another foot by 2050. It'll probably be up by another foot in a few weeks. I mean, there is enough ice on Antarctica and in what remains of the Arctic to raise the sea level by about 270 feet. And that's my bottom line. I won't buy any real estate that's not more than 250 feet above the present sea level. But this is a terrifying problem, and it's been with us for a long time. And the lying jacks in the energy business have known this. They've known it for a long time. We were told about it in 1988 by James Hansen, who is the head of NASA, that this is not going to work. It is not going to work, and it is not working. You get to, if you own a house in Paradise, California, and you're sitting saying, hey, this fire is out of control, burns the town to the ground, kills 100 people. The huge hurricanes, all of these things, the really bad part of this is that, according to Mr. Wells and the people, it's going to get so hot within about 1,000 miles in each direction of the equator that there won't be enough energy to make it cool enough for people to live there anymore. And you'll remember probably from your geography books, the equator runs right through the middle of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It runs across the peninsula of India. It runs right through the Amazon. Where are all these people going to go? They have no place to go. And it's going to happen. A lot of you people in this room will live to see it. The refugee problem, so-called, with maybe 1 million refugees destabilizing Europe, what's going to happen when you have a few 100 million or billion refugees? We're looking at anyway, what I would like to say in closing is that we have a great governor in the state of Washington. He had the nerve to try to get the presidential nomination based on doing something about the climate. There's nothing to have prevented the other 49 governors from saying, Inslee's on to something. We ought to get behind him and actually do something about this instead of let the energy companies tell us, well, it's too fast, we don't want to destabilize the economy, we can adjust to it, or whatever mealy mouth things. And what a possible thing that could happen in this convulsion is that the right wing can cantilever another candidate, perhaps Trump again, or one of the other stand-ins like Cruz or Santos or something like that, with, again, not the popular vote, and they may try to superimpose some kind of rigid authoritarianism on the rest of us. I don't think the Soviet of Washington is going to go for it. I think we're strong enough, and we have to act like Linda acts with the land trust. I was a foot soldier for the Democratic Party here 30 years ago. We took this state away from the Republicans. We have to keep it away from the Republicans. Inslee is trying to do everything he can, and we can do stuff locally. I'm really happy to make this presentation in Waitsburg. Waitsburg is a vibrant community. It's got a great future. We just have to make it stronger, because when the system falls apart, we're going to have to act like we're able to live by ourselves and make our own money and make our own policy and make our own laws. Aaron Burr, who was once the Vice President of the United States, said, law is anything that's boldly stated and plausibly maintained. So the great state of Washington, I have a friend, we used to have a business in Seattle called the Zigzag Gallery and Pot Shop in the 1960s in Seattle. And then about 10 years ago, they legalized marijuana around here. I don't understand how you can do that, because the federal government, it's against the law, it's against the federal law, but it's okay with the state law, and we get away with it somehow. I don't quite get that. It means that they're not enforcing the law if it's not plausibly maintained. It's not really a law, it's a nuisance. And not merely marijuana. Washington was one of the first states to have death with dignity. And abortion was available in Seattle long before Roe v. Wade, and it'll be available in Seattle long after Roe v. Wade. We can't lose sight of the fact that Biden got more votes in Texas than he did in Massachusetts. He just didn't carry the state. One of the best critiques I got of how the South won the Civil War was my old friend Ray Norsworthy, who said this bifurcation between conservatives and liberals is urban and rural. A lot of the people who, let's call them by what the demographers call them, the uneducated white men in this country who live in the rural countryside and follow NASCAR. And we have to be careful, because there are. I'm delighted to see you all here because I think you take ideas seriously. You want the library to function. Buy some books and get the money to the library, because basically, I can think of three major kind of Americans. They're the people who are on drugs. 20% of the population is still smoking, and probably that many are still drunk. Or on, like myself, on prescription drugs. Another third of the country is on sports. We're either on NBA or NFL or hockey or curling or God knows what. And a big hunk of the country is on religion. All of these things are distractions. They're trying to keep us from taking ourselves seriously and operating in the public interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Charles Potts, thank you very much. Welcome to Royal Block. And Charles, if you wouldn't mind taking a chair at that table, anyone interested in a book, if you'd grace them with an autograph and send some money over to the library. Thank you.